All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Current, the North Central Region Water Network Speed Networking webinar series. My name is Ann Nardi, and I'll be the facilitator for today's session. And today's webinar is going to be talking about communicating edge of field practices to landowners. For those who aren't familiar with the North Central Region Water Network, we are a 12-state extension-led collaboration that is dedicated to ensuring safe and sufficient water supplies across the North Central region of the United States. Among our programming, we have this monthly webinar series, which has been going on for 8 or 9 years now. It's framed as a speed networking webinar series. So we feature different speakers who are communicating their research or their work around a similar topic. So excited to have 3 great speakers lined up today to talk about communicating edge of field practices. A couple administrative things before we get started. The first thing is that we will have a dedicated Q&A portion for this webinar. They will be after all 3 of our speakers. So please put your questions for presenters in the Q&A panel. You can find the Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen. It should have Q&A and a couple message bubbles. And you can also upvote other questions. So we most likely will get more questions than we're able to answer in the allotted time here today. So if someone asked a question that you also have, please make sure to upvote it. We will take those questions that are the most popular first and work our way down. If you are experiencing any technical issues or if you have any questions about the webinar series, the North Central Region Water Network, or any of the resources mentioned, feel free to put those questions in the chat. You can also introduce yourself to fellow participants here today and let them know where you're tuning in from. We really use the chat feature, which is also available at the bottom of your screen for communication among attendees, where the Q&A is really where you should list those questions for the presenters to ensure we see them during the facilitated Q&A portion. If you are having any audio issues, there is a phone-in option that can be accessed by clicking the up arrow on the mute icon, and then you can click switch to phone. All right, let's get started here. As I mentioned, we have 3 great speakers who are talking about a similar topic, but from 3 different approaches. So first we have Thad Rhodes with the Kansas Forest Service, who's going to be talking about the factors influencing the adoption of riparian forest buffers in Kansas. Then we have Cole Soldo, who's going to be talking about public perception of constructed wetlands in the Lake Erie Basin and how landowners are approaching constructed wetlands and have their perceptions and attitudes around constructed wetland practices. And then finally, we have John Swanson. John works for Polk County Public Works and is going to be talking a little bit about what works and what doesn't when it comes to those edge of field practices, what's really key when engaging landowners. John has been a big part of the saturated buffer project in Iowa and Polk County, excuse me, and is going to be talking a little bit about the tips and tricks he's learned along the way in terms of that engagement. All of these are really focusing on those practices that can have a huge water quality benefit, but sometimes the benefit to the farmer is really downstream. So really thinking about how do we communicate that when it's not an in-field conservation practice. So excited to be focusing on this and diving a little bit more into the nuances of how we are communicating as conservation and water resource professionals. All right, so our first speaker we'll dive in is Thad Rhodes. I mentioned he's with the Kansas Forest Service. He's a native Kansan, and we're excited for him to be talking a little bit about his research on riparian forest buffers with us today. I'll stop sharing, and Thad, I will hand it over to you.
Hey, thanks, Ann. I appreciate that. And let me try that again. Okay, here we go. Off and running. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm really excited about this opportunity. Just to give everybody a little bit of background, in Kansas, we have about 2.5 million acres of what's considered rural forest land, about 5% of the total state land area. Over 90% of that is privately owned, and a large portion is located adjacent to water bodies. So we're all aware of the benefits that riparian forest buffers can provide with water quality perspective, stream bank stabilization, stream channel stability, wildlife habitat, so on and so forth. So at the time of this research, which was initiated in 2014, I had been working for the Kansas Forest Service as a district forester for about 15 years. Had continued to see areas that were either devoid of trees, riparian forest buffers, and or being pushed out to gain a little bit more farm ground. And so the question then rolled around in my mind: how are we better able to connect with these individuals to relay the importance of riparian areas and riparian forest buffers in general? So this is part of my master's project that was initiated at that time, and hopefully some good information, practical information come out of it. So here is the area that was looked at. This is the Tuttle Creek Reservoir watershed. It's a little over, it's around 10,000 square miles. 70% of it is located in Nebraska. The study area was specific to Kansas. It's primarily row crop agriculture, over 70% of the land use. There was water quality issues identified associated with ag chemicals, eutrophication, sediment. At the lower end of this watershed, there is a federal reservoir of Army Corps of Engineers reservoir, multi-purpose, primarily for flood control, water supply, and navigation further down into the Missouri and the Mississippi River. This reservoir was constructed and completed in the early 1960s. And there has been over 40% of the storage capacity that has been reduced due to a significant amount of sedimentation, primarily stream bank erosion. So with that in mind, and understanding that riparian forest buffers can be part of the answer, the question was posed: why are some landowners in favor of establishing riparian forest buffers or maintaining it, and why are others not? And so with that, two different categories of landowners were identified. Non-adopters were cropland site landowners that were identified as having not enough or a lack of adequate riparian vegetation at the time of the study and analysis. It was done geospatially. 305 non-adopters were identified. Adopters were individuals who had planted riparian forest buffers within the previous 10 years. There are no regulations in Kansas requiring riparian vegetation, so all of these plantings were voluntary. And then we did have some landowners that had both planted trees and then had sites that were deemed as inadequate riparian vegetation. So three different categories that were identified initially. A lengthy questionnaire was developed, over 9 pages, 100+ questions. 4 main latent factors were looked at: the economics, attitudes towards trees, knowledge of the riparian forest buffer benefits, and then the government program perception. Most of these questions dealt with the economic motivation because these are on very productive row crop sites. Likert type scale was used, scale 1 to 7, completely disagree to completely agree, very basic questions based from the tailored design method. Multiple mailings were conducted, promotion ahead of time to try to get the information out so people were comfortable when they received that. And from that, there was 260 questionnaires that were returned. 254 of them were considered to be valid. That's about the 69%. Only responses that could be clearly identified as either non-adopter or adopter were used for the statistical analysis. Some folks ripped off the ID label. Some said, well, my renter, I'm going to have them answer that. We wanted information specific to landowners. So the sample is from 200 non-adopters and 36 adopters. With social research, there's always the opportunity to try to garner information that's in addition to the questions. There's blanks that were provided where people could provide narratives. One individual even took the time to send in these photos. His response was trees were functioning along the river until the winter of 1978, where there was a 2-foot thick ice layer on the river. High flows caused that flooding to basically scrape all the trees off the riverbank and caused it to be vertical. And this was a picture 6 weeks later after that high flow event. So again, a lot of interesting things, but specific to this talk, what I want to provide is some of the data from a few of the questions, a few of the more pertinent questions that were asked. So a quick overview here, non-adopters and adopters. The non-adopters response is in blue on the top. The adopters is in pink. We see the mean of the response score in relation to the Likert scale. Any information there with the asterisks indicates a statistically significant difference, and the confidence intervals are also listed. So starting out with the economics perspective, the monetary aspects resonated higher with non-adopters when looking at concerns about trees located along streams beside the cropland. You can see competition with crop growth, making farming more difficult. These areas don't produce any income. You're taking land out of production. So there is that strong economic factor. When you asked questions about reasons for having trees along streams, producing income rated the lowest. There was just not that perceived value of the wooded areas on their property, the riparian wooded areas. Interestingly, when you asked about what might make these areas more appealing for planting, one of the higher responses was including high value trees for timber production. So when you look at that, that to me says economics is important. We just need to be able to add value to these buffers, whether it's existing buffers, potentially through forest stand improvement to increase the species composition, future timber sales, or with design of new plantings, looking at higher financial value species, designs that are not perceived to be competitive with adjacent croplands. Another high factor in that realm was using faster growing plant material. A lot of these areas are established with conservation grade seedlings, so potentially looking at larger rootstock and or genetically superior rootstock to help accomplish landowner desires. When asked about education, have you previously been exposed to information about the benefits of having trees located along streams? So the adopters, not surprisingly, about 70% says yes, we've been exposed to that information, but over half of the non-adopters did not think that they had received that type of information. So obviously there's a need to continue promoting the value of riparian forest buffers. But interestingly, when asked about reasons for having trees along streams, landowners seem to understand the ecosystem service aspects and the importance of riparian forest buffers. So stream banks, stabilization, water quality benefits, they all seem to rate that fairly highly. And also the important aspects from the farming operation standpoint, the highest responses across the whole survey was this conservation ethic. People want to do the right thing. So when you look at that, if the majority of non-adopters are not exposed to the benefits of having trees along streams, but understand their important functions and have a strong conservation ethic, then possibly we need to do a better job of quantifying what is necessary for a riparian forest buffer to be functional. The methodology identifying the non-adopters did not look at areas that were completely void of trees. It's just that they were lacking. So potentially people see some trees out there and think that's adequate, and that potentially is not the case. The other factors related to providing the necessary resources to establish planting successfully, especially financial and labor assistance. Farmers are busy. There's a lot going on. These are very small areas on the overall farm. So how can we make this more successful as a planting? And then creating awareness of financial assistance programs. These programs have been out there for a long time, but almost 75% of the non-adopters said that they were not familiar with these types of programs. For those who were aware, concerns with regulations and low payments were the most worrisome. So in addition to that, some of the trends that were teased out of it, when asked whether individuals were more interested in learning about the potential benefits of having trees located along streams, 35% of non-adopters said that they would be. About 60% of adopters said that they would be. If there was the wildlife ties, it really seemed to be more interested for the adopters to plant riparian forest buffers, maintain these areas. And then the conservation ethic and legacy desire. Over a third of the respondents indicated that the farms had been in their family for more than 100 years and they planned on keeping it that way. So in closing, I guess I would say there's options that are out there, but there's opportunities that still exist. I think we've addressed the low-hanging fruit, and now we need to find a way to connect with others. There's a lot of opportunities through education, whether that's what's adequate to be considered a riparian forest buffer, or how do you manage existing areas, show that it can be done from a financial and labor perspective, and also have these successful projects that can be shown to the neighbors that it is something that can be done. So this is a very quick overview. There's more information. I'll include these publication links to the publications in the link section. And questions will be at the end. I do want to acknowledge the funding partners, the watershed management section of the Department of Health and Environment, the Kansas Forest Service, and then Tuttle Creek Wraps, a local stakeholder group. So with that, I will turn that over.
Great. Thank you so much, Thad. We really appreciate it. All right, moving on to our second presenter today. We're excited to have Cole Soldo joining us. Cole is presenting some of the work he worked on when he was getting his master's at Ohio State University on constructed wetlands in the Western Lake Erie Basin. Cole is now an outreach conservation professional, so we're excited for him to be joining us today, talk a little bit about his research. I will stop sharing, Cole, and turn it over to you.
All right, thank you so much for having me. Let me get all set up here. All right, good to go. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Anne, for the introduction. My name is Cole Soldo, and I'm going to be talking about the research I used for my master's thesis, which is using constructed wetlands to address water quality challenges, specifically within the Western Lake Erie Basin. To start, I wanted to talk about the problem. Well, what is the problem? What is our overview here? And unfortunately, this is the problem. So as you can see here, these are photos that my colleague and I took in the summer of 2019. And they're photos of the Western Lake Erie Basin's seasonal eutrophication, otherwise known as harmful algal blooms. And these detrimentally harm the physical environment as well as the economic and health of the folks who are invested in the region. And most of this pollution comes from non-point source pollution, primarily phosphorus. And a big part of that is agriculture, as it is the majority of the land use in the region. The Western Lake Erie Basin is a tile-drained landscape, and there's been a historical removal of natural filtration systems. Specifically, the region used to comprise of something known as the Great Blank Swamp, which was a huge swath of wetlands across northwestern Ohio. And this has exacerbated the rate and intensity that phosphorus drains into Lake Erie. So what's to be done? Well, there needs to be a targeted reduction in phosphorus and non-point source pollution. For example, some states such as California and Florida have mandated nutrient reduction programs. But the farmers in the Great Lakes region, especially around Lake Erie, are engaged solely through extension and outreach with voluntary incentive-based programs. And so, for example, the EPA came out with a 2018 action plan about Lake Erie, And their aim was a 40% reduction in phosphorus loads from a 2008 baseline. Now, how do we do that, especially when most of the work that will be done will come through voluntary means with landowners in the region? Well, the good news is there's a lot of work being done already. There are many best management practices that are adopted, such as cover cropping, conservation tillage or no-till, grassed waterways or buffer strips, and constructed wetlands, which I'll be talking about here shortly. And so the knowledge gap for my research I wanted to look at, there's a large body of literature for best management practice adoption. And a lot of these driving factors are monetary consideration, actions of early adopters, social norms and peer pressure, approval and trust, increased communication, and knowledge of environmental issues. And I've shown some of the foundational studies there, and I'll have references at the end of the presentation. But my specific knowledge gap that I wanted to focus on was, while we know something about why farmers engage in conservation, we know less about why wetlands are adopted than we do other edge of field practices. But that's not to say we know nothing. One of the foundational studies that I based my research on was a qualitative interview analysis with Swedish landowners. And the researcher Hansen went to these landowners and had in-person interviews that aimed at curbing eutrophication in the Baltic Sea, and what it would take for landowners to install wetlands on their property. And what they found was that it was a two-step decision for a wetland. If a wetland was going to be on productive land, it was an automatic no for the wetland. But if it was on unproductive land, there were a host of factors that would determine whether or not a landowner would be open to putting a wetland on their property. And these composed of land management in the best possible way, personal environmental responsibility, business considerations, knowledge and understanding, acknowledgement and support, and unfair conditions. And in the bolds are my specific variables that I constructed that I'll show you in a few slides how that was done, but they correspond with the driving factors laid out in Hansen. So I had a couple of research questions that came from this. My first research question was, are farmers in the Western Lake Erie Basin driven by the same motivations found in the analysis of Swedish landowners regarding constructed wetlands? Number two, how does perceived productivity of the land affect the primary motivations and the likelihood of adopting a constructed wetland? And are conservation-minded farmers more likely to hold positive motivational beliefs and less likely to hold the negative beliefs identified in Hansen? As a result, will they be more likely to implement constructed wetlands? Well, what we did was we took this qualitative interview analysis and we made it into a quantitative survey. And as you can see here, this was the study area. We purchased a random sample of about 1,000 potential participants, and we stratified by subbasin and farm size. So we oversampled from Blanchard and Auckley's subbasins because the Nature Conservancy is the ones who commissioned this study, and that was the area they were working in and interested at the time. This was a 5-step mailing through the US Postal Service, and we received about a 34.5% response rate. Now, the challenge with this research was turning a qualitative interview into a quantitative survey. And I want to give you a sense of how we did that. So we would take example quotes like this from Hansen, who this is a landowner quote. I would love to have had a pond for my own interest to have some fish and ducks in. Then I would have been able to fish and hunt a little, something I thought was fun. And so we basically took different constituent items out of this and created reliability measures for the scale variable. For example, the scale variable other beneficial functions consisted of the constituent items that constructed wetlands would enhance the beauty of my farm. They would provide me with valuable hunting opportunities. They would attract desirable waterfowl to my property, and constructed wetlands can help me diversify my income. Now, I don't have a lot of time here, so I'm going to breeze through these, but my slides will be available if you want to see this after, but I'll show you other transpositions here. We have the variable for productivity, which is my land's too productive to justify a constructed wetland. Unfair conditions, so farmers should not be asked to construct wetlands on their land. Lack of acknowledgement and support. Other farmers I respect would not approve of me installing a wetland, or my neighbors would not approve of me installing a wetland. Lack of knowledge and understanding. So I do not know enough about the risks or benefits of having a wetland on my farm. The conservation benefits of wetlands are unclear to me. And business considerations. So I don't want the responsibility of maintaining a constructed wetland, or I do not want the cost to maintain the wetland. And so these motivations and constraints were measured on a Likert scale that ranged from strongly disagree to strongly agree. And we also included for a conservation measuredness. So Arbuckle and McGuire created the Good Farmer Identity Scale, which measured the conservation mindedness of a farmer. And we included that scale as well. An example here is a quote unquote good farmer is one who scouts before spraying for pests, weeds, or disease. And it ranges from not important at all to very important. And so what did we find? Well, in regards to the first research question, are farmers in the Western Lake Erie Basin driven by the same motivations found in the analysis of Swedish landowners regarding constructed wetlands? Well, we found significant positive effects of other beneficial functions and succession, a marginally significant positive effect of farm size, significant negative effect of productivity, and that's great, but what do we take away from that? Well, those who perceive other beneficial functions of a wetland, such as aesthetics, hunting opportunities, diversification of income, and habitat creation, are more likely to adopt a constructed wetland. And those with larger farms and those who plan to pass their farm on to a family member are more likely to adopt a constructed wetland. In regards to the second research question, how does perceived productivity of the land affect the primary motivations and the likelihood of adopting a constructed wetland? Well, the big thing here is none of the impacts of the primary motivations for willingness to adopt for constructed wetland were dependent on levels of perceived productivity in the data. And the takeaway from here is the decision to adopt a constructed wetland is not a two-stage decision governed entirely by productivity. And this is radically different from Hansen's research and something I'm going to go on to in a little bit at the end of my presentation here. And then the third question, are conservation-minded farmers more likely to hold the positive motivation beliefs and less likely to hold the negative beliefs identified in Hansen? As a result, will they be more likely to implement constructed wetlands? So we found a significant direct effect of conservation identity on the likelihood of adopting a constructed wetland. And we found a significant indirect effect through other beneficial functions. And so there was no evidence of full mediation, which means that there was identity had a strong effect separate from measured beliefs about CWs. And I know that's a little dense. So what does that mean? Well, the big takeaways are those with stronger conservation identities are more likely to adopt constructed wetlands, and those with stronger conservation identities are more likely to believe in those other beneficial functions and be more likely to adopt a constructed wetland. So those are great takeaways, but what does this mean in practice? Well, for my money, it means that programs aimed at implementing constructed wetlands should focus on the tangential benefits provided, so those other beneficial functions. So whether that be aesthetics, hunting opportunities, diversification of income, habitat creation. There should be an emphasis on placing constructed wetlands on unproductive land. However, in difference with Hansen, do not discount suitable productive land. Rely on other beneficial functions, succession plans, land legacy, and conservation identity. And that's great, but who are we going to target? How do we target them? Well, my advice would be target larger operations first, as they have a higher likelihood of adopting a constructed wetland. Target farmers who have a strong conservation identity. And you say, well, how do we find those folks? I would recommend perhaps looking at farmers or operations with other best management practices already installed. And look for those farmers who have higher conservation identities, who have stronger identities like that. And they tend to be younger, have higher, more flexible income, have greater access to information, and those with larger social circles. And I recommend that there be higher financial incentives, both at the front end and throughout the duration of a wetland's life. That will be more attractive to potential adopters. And I know it varies in different states, but from what I found so far, most of wetland programs are kind of front loaded, like the costs will be taken care of in the beginning, but then there's no money throughout the rest of the wetland's life. And I think it would be more attractive if there were annual such payments, like in the Conservation Reserve Program or something similar. And I did want to note in this study, looking at constructed wetlands in the Western Lake Erie Basin, may be a little different than other parts of the country because there's a very strong personal historical connection to that region. A lot of the Great Black Swamp was drained by ancestors of the folks who farm on this now. And so there may be greater resistance just to familial ties in the region, but that's something to look out for moving forward. And then, as always, with almost any program, increased communication between program providers and farmers. There should be a higher acknowledgement and support throughout the process. And with that, I want to thank you. Here are references of the foundational studies I referenced earlier. I'm sorry I breezed through those other slides, but they will be available if you need them. And I thank you for your time. And I just want to thank my advisor, Dr. Robin Wilson at Ohio State. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Cole. We really appreciate it. Very interesting work. Always find that the work coming out of Robin Wilson's lab interesting, and this is no exception. So thank you, Cole, for your time today. All right, I'm excited for our final speaker. John Swanson is joining us. John is a water resources supervisor in Polk County in central Iowa. And if you've heard of the saturated buffer project or batch and build in Polk County, Iowa, John has been a leader on that project. And so he's talked a lot about saturated buffers with landowners. So I'm excited to get some of his thoughts on what works and what doesn't when you're talking about these edge of field practices with landowners, and how to sometimes take that research that we just heard and translate it, make it a reality on the ground. Thanks so much for joining us here, John. I will stop sharing and turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Ann. I will share my screen. There we go. So again, John Swanson here, Central Iowa. I'm a conservationist, been working across Central Iowa for the last little over 10 years, ag, urban, flood control, water quality, and really spent a lot of years doing things not incredibly successfully, not to the level that we need in Iowa, at least. So we're very aggressive trying to reach some statewide goals. Several years ago, we kind of took a step back and said, how can we do things different, specifically about edge of field practices, including saturated buffers and bioreactors, and had some great responses from landowners. And really, and since that early success, we've now been applying those lessons to almost every type of practice that we do. And we've continued to see some very common themes about how do you communicate with landowners and how do you do it good. So that's what I'm talking about today. Ann asked me to kind of our take on landowner communication. I tried to boil it down to top 5 points, 5 keys. I got 7. So here we go. We're going to finish strong. Number 1, truly targeting and mapping. So again, in one case, it might be a saturated buffer, might be a wetland, but this idea of targeting a practice or targeting an environmental issue that says, we want to find landowners to target this specific issue, going through the mapping process, and all that to create what I call a priority list of fields or landowners, a hit list. I've been told don't call it a hit list, but really, if it's say 50 landowners, what are the 50 landowners that we need to talk to? We need to get in front of them, and we really want to talk to them about the specific targets. And by doing this targeting, by really proactively reaching out to these folks, we found that it really simplifies the conversation. I think all too often we talk about too many practices, we talk about too many environmental goals, and people tend to, their eyes glaze over. It can just be an overwhelming amount of information. And the second part of the targeting that seems really important is starting with low-hanging fruit. So saturated buffers, we want to get started off on the right foot. We knew that if people already had a riparian buffer in place, they're like halfway there. Let's start with those folks and try and get some early success under our belts. So lesson number 1 for outreach is be proactive, target folks, try and get in front of people that have a good chance of the practice working on their property right off the bat. Number 2, assigning a project coordinator. So I've done this myself. I've been a part of many offices. Someone calls the office. They say they've talked to several other people. They keep getting diverted to another person. They keep getting different information from each person they talk to. And quite frankly, it can be very disheartening for a landowner or a farmer or a homeowner. And so that's why when we do this targeting, right off the bat, we assign a project coordinator to really be the face of our work for that landowner. So it could be Ruth McCabe there, who's a local conservation agronomist with a co-op. It could be a government employee. it could be anybody, but the key is we found with outreach is by having a face of your project, it one helps you build a relationship, and it gets away from that like classic bureaucratic experience of talking to different people and getting different answers and causing some confusion. So again, when we assign a person to work with that landowner, when it's from day one, initial outreach to surveying fields, to arranging meetings, to constructing, to dealing with issues, if they know who to call and they pick up the phone and call that person and they're always there to help them along the way, we've just proved it really simplifies the conversation and makes it more successful. So really trying to cater that, providing good customer service to people has proven to be really successful. Number 3, I don't know if any of you all have done this. I bet a lot of people on this call have. There's a lot of people here. Cold calling landowners can be an incredibly painful experience. It also can be an incredibly educational experience. I like all of our new coordinators to do some level of cold calling because it's like an experience like, how do you pitch conservation to people? But my number 3 is cold calls for success. So when we do outreach, getting people on the phone, like getting in front of people and actually talking to them is like one of the most important parts. But before you pick up the phone and call somebody, we do almost like an investigative report. We look at files, we talk to people. Who do these people know? So when we get them on the phone, we at least know who we're talking to. Or like, are they the decision maker for that farming operation? Are they one of a dozen family members that live in the area? Are there interconnectedness between different landowners? Is one landowner the farmer for another landowner? Like knowing who you're going to call, like at least know as much as you can, is going to put yourself a one step forward in that cold call scenario. The second part is use existing relationships. If you know farm owner John has a field that looks great for this practice, who knows John? Who could help maybe create the introduction for you? Could you just avoid the cold call completely? Because that's going to put you another step forward. So using existing relationships, and that kind of gets back to knowing your watersheds, speaks to the longer you work in an area, the more people you know, the better it's going to help you. And some of that just has to come with longevity. I also tossed in there a mailer. So again, I think many of us have done mailers before. I at one point said, I'm not doing any more mailers because I don't think anybody's reading this. People don't call me when I send out a mailer. But we took it a step further and said, how could we, like, a mailer is a great way to break the ice. And so what we would do is when we would target a field, we'd send out a mailer, we'd send out a map of what field we think has a great option of potentially working for this practice. And we stated, hey, this project coordinator is going to call you within 7 days. And so then if by chance they did read that mailer and they do know what field you're talking about, your cold call just made a one step further towards success. If they didn't, what harm did it take? But we actually were pleasantly surprised that people did read it and they were expecting the call from us. And the last one is, if you're making a cold call, you can't try to like explain what a saturated buffer is and how it works, for example, because it can get, you can't explain too much in a quick phone call that you're catching somebody off guard. So usually our cold calls were very simple. A simple goal of that call is, hey, we're working in your area. We want to see if this field would really work for this practice. Would you care? Could we meet you out in the field, or could we just go survey your field and then get back to you with what might work? Number 4, the end all goal of all communications is to try and build a relationship. And this is huge and really difficult to do, especially for young conservationists, because it takes time. And our number one motto is set a goal and meet a goal. And what that means is, if you are working with a landowner and we say, hey, will you give us permission? And when they give you permission to survey, if you're like, we're going to survey this, we're going to get back to you in 6 weeks. And if you tell them 6 weeks and you meet that goal, they're like, oh, these people are legit, and it gains some like legitimacy to that relationship. And then if you say another goal, like, we're going to do this next step and we're going to get back to you in, maybe it's a week or maybe it's 6 months. But the more you set a goal and meet a goal, that same coordinator that they keep touching base with, it just simply proves to be successful. And it's a way to like build that relationship. Second one, customer service, salesmanship. Kind of to me, the day is like, you can't be the person that's 4 o'clock, I'm out here, I'm leaving. I also know, like, I'm not saying everyone has to work till 8 o'clock at night. Some of us may battle with that personal work-life balance. But if landowners we found have a certain like in their world, like with agriculture, they have a certain level of customer service they're used to. And if you get a call, like maybe you can't answer it at that point, but be available to people, and people appreciate you answering the phone, getting back to them. Maybe you don't have an answer for them till tomorrow, but they appreciate it, and it helps building that relationship. And then again, we always say it's a marathon, not a sprint. Folks are going to not want to work with you, and like that's okay. But you find those low-hanging fruits, you have good experiences with them, and by being there over time, maybe year after year, and having good experiences with folks, it can turn into like this long game where people eventually are probably going to work with you. And the last one that I have there, I say ask the question. This is what a lot of our communications leads up to, is if you can get, and this has been kind of changing for our team, is can you get in a room with a landowner where you're kind of in a safe space and you can ask them, like, simply, what would it take to get you to do this practice or to try and achieve this goal? And if you can get to a place where you can truly ask that question and they can answer it sincerely, it's going to really help dictate how you can get more done in your watershed. Number 5 out of 7 is know your practice and your programs. We've seen there's a lot of legitimate fears around, don't mess it up. Like, my drainage works. I don't want to do anything that's going to mess up that drainage. And that's where it's like, no matter what the practice is, you truly have to like be able to say, we're not going to negatively impact this. And you have to be able to follow through on that. Because if you don't, you're going to take 5 steps backwards. We've seen specifically about saturated buffers and bioreactors, there's a lot of misinformation is out there. And so sometimes you come into your communication and right off the bat, people have negative thoughts or a lot of unknowns. And so you kind of have to expect that. And by like, the more experience you can gain, the more you're going to help combat that. And really, like, you have to get to a point where hopefully you can be the conservation professional, but we know that builds time. And when we have young people, it's really about a young coordinator has a network of resources around them. So it's like, it's okay not to have the answer. Honestly, the worst thing you can do is start talking too much and saying things that you don't really know about. So it's okay to be like, I don't know, let me find out and get back to you. And lastly, the one thing that we can all know is being an expert on your government programs. If you don't know your own programs, again, you're not going to be that professional resource to these landowners. And it's going to be hard to have real good communication and relationship building with those folks. Number 6 is know your hurdles. And this kind of like brings it all back together. So knowing who you're cold calling, knowing what their background is, knowing, being able to ask that question, like, why is this practice not getting adopted? So I spent 5 years trying to get people to install saturated buffers, and I installed 6 of them. We were able to finally take a step back and say, why are people not installing these? And we heard things like they're getting lost in the conversation around erosion-based practices. Some water quality practices simply have no benefit to the landowner. So it's hard for them to rank those higher than practices where they have an imminent need. Lack of understanding around practices, mixed program directions. If they're talking to different programmatic folks and they're getting different answers, it's a quick way to scare folks away. Tax considerations, but at the end of the day, probably the biggest hurdle we've run into is what we call the hassle factor. People are really busy nowadays. We're all busy. Farmers, landowners, they probably have another job. They're probably trying to get their kids to soccer practice. How can you be very efficient with their time? And if you can be efficient with your communications, it can help address that hurdle. And that leads to my last one. We make a concerted effort to minimize touches. So the whole saturated buffer project, and we've now applied this to other practices as well. We've focused on 3 touches. Touch number 1 is a cold call. And all we want out of that cold call is just permission to survey and understand that we're trying to treat tile outlets. Can we get out in your field and we're going to report back to you? Second touch is a feasibility sit down. For the first time, we want to sit down at their kitchen table. We want to just we want the goal of them to understand how these practices work and garner whether we have support, hesitation, or just kind of what are their feelings around the practices. And if they're supportive, we're going to keep rolling. We're going to go forward with design. We're going to line up the funding. And then the last and final touch is the big detailed one. We cross all the T's and dot the I's and do a final sign up. And it's sort of like some people want a lot more touches than that. And like, that's awesome. But many do not. Like, they're really busy people. And if you come in like very upfront, like, this is what I want out of this communication, and you know what they want and you can achieve it, boom, move on. You set a goal, you meet a goal. And boom, that's what I got. Ending with some cute pictures of my little girls playing in water. That's communication for us.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. All right. So we're getting lots of claps here, John. Thank you. I really appreciate that. These are the tips. This is what we found works in really getting into the logistics of it too, because we can talk about how we frame the message, but getting a hold of the person, you kind of have to do that first before you can frame the message. So really appreciate that. We do have a lot of questions coming in, so we'll dive right in. We have about 15 minutes to talk about questions here today. The first one is actually for Thad. And it's not a communication question. It is a little bit about the riparian forest buffer. So I don't know if you'll know the answer to this one or not, but and this question is from Mark, noting that in the prairie area of Nebraska and Kansas, have there been comparisons between deep-rooted grasses as opposed to trees for that stream bank erosion? This may or may not fall within your purview. I'm not sure.
Sure. So there may be several out there. The only one that I am familiar with was associated with the 1993 floods. Geyer out of K-State, Kansas State University, looked at some aerial photography, and I believe this is right, along the Kansas River, comparing land use between trees, crops, and grass. I'm not sure if the grass was tame pasture or native prairie. From what I can remember, the forest buffers accumulated sediment. The grass lost, I believe, about 80 feet. Cropland lost about 150 feet. So I'm sure there's more out there. That's one that I am familiar with that compares different land use types.
Great, thank you. Appreciate that. I mean, I know a lot of times when as conservation, we think about the buffer, whether it's trees or grasses, having that buffer is really going to be key. And Peter Chase, I think probably this one is for you, Thad, as well, but are there support programs that you mentioned? You mentioned financial support, and that, folks really just aren't as aware. Maybe it's second nature to you, but not to the landowner in terms of the financial resources available. Are those support programs nationwide for riparian buffer installation?
So I think probably that one of the more familiar ones is the USDA Farm Service Agency. The Conservation Reserve Program has a specific aspect of planting riparian forest buffers. I'm sure each state has some form that would allow that, and potentially some specific grants through specialized groups. But nationwide, I think CRP is probably going to be the main one.
Yeah, absolutely. Great, thanks. Crystal Powers has a really interesting question for probably Thad and Cole, folks who are, reviewing some of the literature in terms of farm owner perceptions and adoption. So I know, Cole, this question came for you. You mentioned Jay Arbuckle's work on farmer ideology, the good farmer ideology. She's wondering, have you seen any work on building conservation identities in farmers? Like, where do these identities come from? Have you seen work in terms of building that? A lot of times we think of that as like a core belief that's kind of stable within a human, whether they have that quote unquote conservation ethic or good farmer ethic.
That's an excellent question. I can point you to several different meta-analyses. Liu did a great meta-analysis on conservation identity. But as far as kind of my personal thought on the matter, I would say that, acknowledgement and support, and then the social norms and peer pressure are so important. If you can focus on those early adopters and then kind of lead the way through that, it's kind of a, following, seeing what works, and inherently over time, it will build that conservation identity. Sorry if that's a little general, but I think focusing on those early adopters with those conservation mindedness, and then having that expand outwards, I think that's the best way to get that done. I'm sure there's a lot of literature that I do not have on the top of my head, but I can point you to some of those meta-analysis, and there's a lot of great work done on that. So sorry if that was a little expository. But...
No, thanks. John or Thad, anything to add in terms of sometimes I feel like that's either like you have that conservation ethic or you don't, in terms of definitely with the surveys that they come out with, it seems a little bit more intrinsic to someone.
I'd agree with Cole's comments about the peer-to-peer aspect. Seeing somebody and visiting with somebody that has done that and shows it can work rather than a government entity speaking at you saying you should do this. I think that's key.
Great. This question is probably for Thad. Matthew Waldroth is curious, how do you think people find the idea that trees are good for land and being a good steward? I think your presentation was an interesting one, and it kind of is supported by what John was saying with saturated buffers. There's a lot of time, there is an information gap. Sometimes we think in communicating, it's not just about the facts, but there is a little bit of an information gap in terms of, is this sufficient trees? Are trees going to be a good, good for the land, good for that buffer, as well as like the misconceptions that come along with it? Where do you think folks are finding the idea that trees are good for the land?
Sure. So I think that's an excellent question. I mean, probably what happens realistically with the traditional type producers, the farmers, it's the local field offices, whether it's USDA and or extension. And a lot of that then ties back to how familiar and supportive and encouraging they are to promote forestry. And that's just like anything else. There's a lot of different dynamics with personal aspect, but I think that's probably where a lot of it comes from. And then the peer-to-peer aspect, if there's somebody local that has done the practice that speaks positive about it, then that's going to garner more interest and get people thinking about, I should be doing that on my own property. But that's an excellent question. How do we reach out to those individuals best?
Yeah, great point. I know that's something the North Central Region Water Network is looking at a lot with our team, is peer-to-peer farmer learning and doing that through a couple different grant projects. So yeah, understand that for sure. Here's a question from Aaron Field for John. So Farm Bill year, we all know that. What resources or programs do you think we need to build on that kind of long-term relationship dedicated coordinator model that you described? It's not always like our funding mechanisms aren't built for that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something we've really struggled with in Iowa. It's where I can speak to where I was a young coordinator for a time where it's like you work year to year and it's like you're either good at your job or you're like always looking for that next job. And that's really counterproductive for building relationships. Like I've often joked, the easiest way to kill a watershed project is to do 3 coordinators in 3 years. The project's dead. You're going to need to take 5 to 10 years off and try again. So like we've really taken a local approach to trying to like have local communities and local government agencies see these local defined benefits. And in some extent, we've tried to like create our own funding mechanisms with local communities, like trying to bridge an ag-urban partnership where the urban folks may want to provide funding to help ag stuff happen upstream. So I can just speak to the importance of it. And at the end of the day, you have to have people that stick around. Like people know that if you're like, I'll be here next year if any issues happen, and issues may happen and you're here and you help them figure it out. It's like, that's when you really start, the snowball really starts getting bigger.
Yes, absolutely. And I know I will do a little plug here for the North Central Region Water Network's Confluence for Watershed Leaders. I can put the website in there, but really what that is trying to do is provide peer-to-peer learning for folks that are working in watersheds. And that includes folks at the county level working on water and conservation related issues, trying to make sure we kind of have that professional development, professional organization for folks working at a watershed scale, including farmer leaders, but also the folks that, SWCDs, extension, farmers union, you name it. So I'll put a link to that there, but I definitely understand it. Dave Zer had a comment, or Dan Zer had a comment in the chat kind of similar, and that it does take time. And sometimes when you're expected to report on what you're seeing on an annual basis, it may take 3 years before you start seeing a lot of the fruits of that. So you've definitely shown through the saturated buffer project that once you get rolling, you can show a lot. There's another question for you, John, from Kevin Kuhn. Are you working with producers, or do you or anyone else to discuss nutrient management system for their infield program? Do you approach that differently?
I don't specifically. I definitely stick more to the structural side, and part of that's because of like who I am. I'm like from the city of Des Moines. It's not like I didn't grow up on a farm, so I've never felt comfortable in like leading that type of work. And I think folks have appreciated that versus like we have other team members, largely NRCS and SWCD employees, that really are getting into the nutrient and infield management practices. And as far as infield goes, we have really started looking at programmatically, how do we simplify like cover crops? We actually, as a county, bought a cover crop seeder and partnered with local ag business to try and streamline a sign up and application process. But we really, like, I have other professionals that I lean on for some of those things because it's just my area of expertise.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Question from Ed Weinberg for Cole. When was your survey of farmers taken? Was it before or after the H2 Ohio funded wetlands program? Because he wonders if maybe that had effect on folks' impressions.
It was right before the expansion. It was coming, so it was big news, but it hadn't launched right then. So it was right
Okay.
before.
Yeah, interesting to think about how it's going on in the context of the state. This is from Ed as well. You know, I know I've heard this question a lot of times from folks. For farmers smitten with regenerative ag, good soil health and carbon markets, can you get carbon credits for adding riparian buffers? That's probably outside of your day-to-day scope. Any thoughts?
So I think there's opportunities in Kansas specifically. There's not been a lot of interest yet. My understanding is because of the financial aspect to the landowner. I think that has the ability to change. And actually, just last week, I was visiting with a producer about potentially doing tree plantings through carbon sequestration. So I think that's coming. We're in the early stages of that yet. But yes, I think that will get an interest because of the economic aspect and the incentives that provides. So good question.
All right, great. A lot of questions coming up here. We probably have time for maybe one or two more. Melanie Babin is curious, what is a simple, clear way to help people consider their downstream neighbors or aquatic communities? I know you guys talked a little bit about, you know, stressing some of those benefits like wildlife, you know, stressing legacy of the land. Any kind of thoughts you want to add in terms of when it's not benefiting you, it's benefiting downstream? How do we talk about that?
So I'll just toss in there a couple things. Stream and water-based cleanups are like the one community event that is like really gets people connected to water and get people like finding ways to connect people with their water resource so they care more about it than it's just some unnamed creek or a river that they never recreate on. Some of our best events have been like ag urban partnership events. We once did one where we had a little a developer and a city council member got in a little bit of an argument on a panel. And I still remember all the farmers saying like, wow, we really thought we would be the controversial ones here. And it was like, it was eye-opening for them to see how like diverse a watershed can be. And they became really engaged in like what was happening on the urban side. So like anything to like do something different, think outside the box has been big for us.
And I think that it ties back to, from my research, the educational component and then the conservation ethic. Again, farmers are really good people. They want to do the right thing. They're there to give themselves a good name. They're proud of what they do, as they should be. It's just trying to show that the riparian aspect is something that should be considered in the equation of the overall farm and the watershed.
And I agree with both panelists, absolutely. I will say that physical reminders are a big one. Part of that Great Lakes Restoration Initiative was an early warning system for algal blooms. So it may come like it alerts on your phone, things like that. So just having those physical connections or reminders is just vital.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I think that's important to note. Okay, we probably have time for one last question. This question is for John, and I know the answer to it, having worked on this project for a little while, but you know, what information do you need to determine if a practice will be successful in a particular field? You know, who's doing the work to identify if that practice will be to be successful in a particular field? I think it's like, how do you create that hit list that you talked about? I know we don't like hit list.
Yeah. Don't call it a hit list, but it's a hit list. So for saturated buffers and bioregions, we use the ACPF, the Agricultural Conservation Planning Framework tool, which is a simple GIS mapping tool. but now we're doing a batch and build for wetlands. We're doing urban soil quality restorations. It's all about what is the practice and who are the experts, who are the researchers, who has the tools, and you really just have to do your homework. So right now we're going through a mapping. We found wetlands have to be much more strategically placed on the landscape. So we're mapping out all of our wetlands, and it's more complicated than saturated buffer. So it's about the process of who are the experts and what are the tools that are available. And just as a team, you're like, we're going to do this practice this year, for example. And then just the mapping is where it all starts.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a good point. And I did put the link to ACPF, or the Agriculture Conservation Planning Framework. I know John spoke a lot about that, but for those that might be interested, there's more information there. All right, I have 3 o'clock on the dot, so I will go ahead and share my screen. Thank you so much for all of our speakers for joining us today. I know we have a lot more questions that I didn't get to today. I apologize about that. So feel free to ask or to reach out to our presenters individually to follow up. I know, John, you already had a speaking request in the chat, so feel free to email John and others directly to talk a little bit more about that. If you had a burning question today that didn't get answered, that's a great way to approach it and follow up. So just another note, this is recorded. We'll have the recording and the presentation slides from today's webinar up on our website at northcentralwater.org in the next day or two. So be sure to watch that. And we will also be having the current webinar series in April. But even before that, our Soil Health Nexus team does have a webinar next Wednesday at the same time. It's going to be with Andrea Bash and one of her graduate students out of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, talking about lessons learned from on-farm cover crop research in Nebraska. So you can go to that link to find more information. All right, with that, I will let everyone go. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you especially to our speakers, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.